It's strange. You're the easiest person in my life to be around and the hardest one to define. She said it quietly, not like a confession, more like she was noticing something out loud. We were sitting across from each other at a small table, late enough that the place was almost empty, and she didn't look at me when she said it. She just kept tracing the edge of her glass with her finger. I didn't respond, because I didn't know how to place what she meant. Then she added, "I don't think you realize how rare that is." I nodded once, said nothing, because for 10 years, we had been exactly that. Easy, undefined, and that sentence was the first time it didn't feel simple anymore. That's where this starts. Before that night, before she said that sentence, you need to understand what those 10 years actually looked like, because nothing about it felt like it was leading anywhere. And that's exactly why it mattered. I met Sarah when neither of us had anything settled. Not careers, not relationships, not even a clear sense of direction. It was a small group setting, maybe 8 people, nothing structured. Someone introduced us. We spoke for 15 minutes, then moved on. That was it. No moment that stood out. No reason to think it would become anything beyond that. A few weeks later, we ran into each other again. Different place. Same kind of conversation. Easy. No effort. That was the first thing I noticed. There was no version of myself I had to adjust. No need to be more interesting than I was. No need to explain things clearly just to keep the conversation going. I could leave sentences unfinished and she would still understand the direction. That doesn't happen often. We didn't become close immediately. It wasn't one of those instant connections people talk about. It happened gradually. A message here, a short call there. Then one day, without deciding it, we were part of each other's routine. At that point, my life wasn't stable. I was building something that wasn't holding yet, trying different directions, starting things, letting them go when they didn't work, starting again. From the outside, it didn't look like progress. From the inside, it was, just not in a way that could be explained easily. Sarah never tried to define it. That was different. She didn't ask for certainty I didn't have. Didn't try to turn it into something cleaner than it was. She would ask simple questions. What are you working on right now? I would explain what I could. Not everything, just enough. She would listen, then say something like, "Does it make sense to you?" "Yes." Then keep going. That was it. No added advice. No attempt to shape it. Just clarity. If you've ever had someone in your life who doesn't try to improve your direction, just makes you more certain of it, you know how rare that is. If that feels familiar, stay with me. Because that kind of presence becomes invisible when it's consistent. We saw each other through different versions of life. Relationships that didn't last. Plans that didn't hold. Moments where things felt like they were finally aligning and then didn't. I remember one night, around 11:50, sitting in her car outside my place after something I'd been working toward for months had just fallen apart. I didn't explain it properly. Didn't need to. She listened, looked at me, then said, "You're not wrong. You're just early." I nodded, didn't respond, because that sentence stayed. There were other moments like that. Small, precise. At one point, after I spent 10 minutes explaining something that wasn't clear yet, she stopped me and said, "You're adding layers to something that doesn't need them." I paused, looked at her, then said, "You're right." She nodded, and we moved on. That was the pattern. She didn't overextend, didn't explain things further than they needed to go, just adjusted them. She had her own things too. Work that shifted, people who left, expectations that didn't hold. And I was there for those moments the same way she was for mine. Not trying to fix anything, just present. That's harder than it sounds. Most people try to improve situations. She didn't. She just stayed in them. There was no pressure in it. That's the part one didn't question. We didn't define what we were. Didn't need to. There was no moment where one of us said, "What is this?" Because asking that question would have changed something. And nothing about it felt like it needed to change. We didn't talk every day. Didn't need to. There were gaps. Days where we didn't speak. Then we'd meet again and nothing needed to be restarted. The conversation would just continue, like it had never paused. That kind of continuity is easy to underestimate. because it doesn't feel like effort. Looking back now, there were signals. Small ones. That didn't connect at the time. The way she noticed things about me before I said them. The way I would compare other relationships to something I couldn't define. The way nothing else felt as easy as this. At the time, I didn't question any of that. I just accepted it. Because it worked. I remember one afternoon, around 4:30, sitting across from her in a quiet cafe. We had both come straight from different parts of the day. No plan. Just met. At one point, she said, "You always sound like you're explaining things to other people." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" She shrugged slightly. "Like you're translating your thoughts into something that makes sense for them." I thought about that, then said, "Maybe." She nodded. "You don't do that with me." I didn't respond, because she was right. That was the difference. With her, nothing needed to be adjusted. Not the way I spoke. Not the way I thought. Not the way I showed up. Everything else in my life required some level of interpretation. With her, it didn't. And because it didn't, I didn't look at it closely. Didn't question it. Didn't try to define it. Because defining it would have required changing it. And there was no reason to do that. Then that night happened. Late. Quiet. Almost empty room. We had been talking for a while. Nothing specific, just the kind of conversation that moves without direction. She said one sentence. "It's strange, you're the easiest person in my life to be around and the hardest one to define." And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't hear it as an observation. I heard it as something unresolved, something that had been there the entire time, waiting to be noticed. I didn't respond to what she said, not because I didn't hear it, because I didn't know where to place it. We stayed there for a few more minutes. Same table, same quiet. Nothing in the room had changed. People still talking in low voices. A couple near the back finishing their drinks. The kind of environment where conversations don't need to be rushed. She didn't repeat what she said. Didn't try to explain it. Just let it sit between us. That mattered. Because if it had been something she wanted to clarify, she would have. I said something else instead. Not connected. Just continued the conversation. And she followed it. Easily. Like she always did. On the surface, nothing shifted. But something had. Not in what we said. In what I was paying attention to. If you've ever heard something that changes the meaning of everything that came before it, you know how hard it is to go back to not hearing it. If that feels familiar, stay with me. Because that sentence didn't stay in that room. I left around midnight. Walked out into the cold air. Same street. Same rhythm. Nothing unusual. But I didn't get into the car right away. I stood there for a second, looking at nothing in particular. Just replaying it. Not the exact words. The way she said it. The tone. The absence of effort behind it. That's what stayed. I drove home slowly. Not because I had to. Because I didn't want to rush the thought. The roads were mostly empty. Street lights spaced out just enough to create a pattern. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about work. Not about what I needed to fix. Not about what was moving. Just her. That was new. Not that I hadn't thought about her before. Of course I had. But not like that. Not in a way that required reevaluating something. I started noticing things I hadn't connected before. Not new memories. Existing ones. Just seen differently. The night in her car. You're not wrong. You're just early. The way she said it. Not comforting. Not dismissive. Just precise. The afternoon in the cafe. You don't translate things for me. The way she didn't need more explanation. The way I didn't need to give it. The number of times I had compared something I was in to something I couldn't fully describe. A standard that didn't have a clear reference point. At least that's what I thought. And as I drove, it became obvious. The reference point had always been there. I just hadn't labeled it. I got home around 12:30. Parked. Sat in the car for a minute longer than usual. Engine off. No music. Just still. And I realized something clearly. I had spent years not thinking about it. Not questioning it. Not because it wasn't there. Because it didn't need to be questioned. It worked exactly as it was. But that sentence changed the position of it. From something stable to something undefined. And once something becomes undefined, you start trying to understand it. I went inside. Didn't turn anything on. Just walked through the same routine. Set my keys down. Poured a glass of water. Sat on the edge of the couch. And the thought didn't leave. Not in a loud way. Just consistently present. I try to frame it logically. If this had been something else, someone else, it would have been obvious. But because it was her, it wasn't. Because we had built 10 years of something that didn't need a label. And labeling it now would change it. I looked at my phone once. Not to call her. Just out of habit. Her name was there. Same as always. Nothing new. No message. No follow-up. Because she hadn't said anything beyond that sentence. And that made it clearer. She wasn't pushing it. She had just noticed it. Out loud. I didn't sleep well that night. Not because something was wrong. Because something was finally clear. And clarity has a way of staying with you until you respond to it. By the time the morning came, I already knew what I needed to do. Not because I had planned it. Because there wasn't another option that made sense. I picked up the phone, looked at her name, paused for a second, then pressed call, because ignoring it was no longer possible. She picked up on the second ring. "Hey," she said, same tone as always. Nothing in her voice suggested she was expecting this call. "Hey." There was a short pause. Not uncomfortable, just unplanned. "You're up early," she said. "I am. Everything okay?" "Yes." Another pause. Then she said, "All right, what's going on?" I didn't answer immediately. Not because I didn't know, because I wanted to say it cleanly, without turning it into something heavier than it needed to be. "I've been thinking about what you said last night." Silence. Not long. Just enough. "Which part?" she asked. I let that sit for a second, then said, "About me being easy and hard to define." There was a longer pause this time. Not confusion. Recognition. "Okay," she said. Her tone shifted slightly. Still calm. Just more present now. "I didn't respond to it at the time," I said. "I noticed. I didn't know where to place it." "That makes sense." We both stayed quiet for a moment, not filling the space, because neither of us needed to rush this. I shifted slightly in a chair, looked at the table in front of me, then said, "I think I know where to place it now." No interruption. Just listening. "What does that mean?" she asked. I exhaled once. Not heavily. Just enough. "I think I've been measuring everything in my life against something I never defined," I said. Silence. Then she said, "Okay." I didn't know what that reference point was. I added. Another pause. Then I said it. "I think it's you." There was no immediate response. No reaction. Just quiet. Longer this time. I didn't break it. Because if she needed time, it mattered. Then she said quietly, "Us." Yes. No hesitation. Just the word. She exhaled slowly. Not sharply. Just something settling. "Okay," she said. That was it. No surprise. No confusion. Just acknowledgement. I waited. Not for her to say more. Just letting the moment exist. Then I said, "I didn't see it before." "I know." That stopped me for a second. Not because it was unexpected. Because it was accurate. "You knew?" I asked. She paused. Then said, "I didn't sit there and think about it directly." "Then how?" "I just didn't ignore it." I nodded. "That made sense. Why didn't you say anything?" I asked. She took a second. Then said, "Because it worked." I leaned back slightly. That answer landed clean. No emotion attached. Just structure. "We had something that didn't need to be explained," she added. "Yes. And explaining it would have changed it." "That's true." We both went quiet again. This time not because we didn't know what to say. Because we were both adjusting to what had already been said. Then she asked, "What made you think about it now?" I looked at the wall in front of me. Then said, "Because I couldn't stop thinking about it after you said it." That was honest. No attempt to adjust it. She didn't respond immediately. Because that part didn't need a reaction. I kept going through everything. I added. What everything? Every time I compared something and didn't know what I was comparing it to. She exhaled once. Slow. That makes sense. And I realized, I said, then stopped. Not because I didn't know the sentence. Because I wanted it to be clear. I realized I wasn't missing something. Pause. I was ignoring something. That landed. She didn't respond right away, because that sentence didn't need to be filled. After a few seconds, she said, "So what does that mean now?" I thought about that. Not long. Just enough. It means I don't think we can pretend it's the same anymore. No, that was immediate, because she already knew that part. We could ignore it, she said. We could. Go back to how it was. I nodded. That would work. Another pause. Then she said, "But it wouldn't feel the same." No, that part was clear. We stayed in that space for a moment, not moving forward yet, because once you move forward, there's no going back. Then I said, "I think we should try." No build-up, no explanation, just the sentence. She didn't answer immediately. Not hesitation. Just wait. 10 years of something stable, shifting in one direction. That's not a quick response. Then she said, "Okay." Simple. No conditions. No questions. Just the answer. We both laughed slightly after that. Not because anything was funny, because it felt unfamiliar. "This is strange," she said. "It is. Not bad." No. Another pause. Then she said, "We're going to have to figure this out as we go." I nodded. "We already do that." She smiled. I could hear it. That's true. We didn't stay on the call much longer. There wasn't anything else to define yet. "All right," she said. "I'll see you later." "Yes." "Okay." The call ended. I set the phone down. Didn't pick it back up. Didn't replay the conversation. Because for the first time, there was nothing unclear. We hadn't analyzed it. Hadn't explained it perfectly. Hadn't tried to define it fully. We just recognized it and decided not to ignore it anymore. That was enough. The first time I saw her after that call, nothing looked different. That was the part one noticed immediately. Same place we had been dozens of times before. Small cafe. Around 6:20. Early enough that it wasn't crowded yet. She was already there when I walked in. Same seat. Same posture. Looking at something on her phone. She looked up when I got closer. "Hey," she said. "Hey." No hesitation. No awkwardness. Just the same beginning. I sat down across from her. For a second, neither of us said anything. Not because it was uncomfortable, because we were both aware that something had changed, even if nothing around us had. The waiter came over. We ordered. Simple. Same as always. Routine stayed intact. That mattered, because nothing about what we were trying needed to replace what already worked. She looked at me for a second, not studying, just noticing. "This feels the same," she said. "It does." Another pause. Then she added, "But it's not." No. We both smiled slightly, because that was exactly it. If you've ever stepped into something new that looks exactly like what you already had, you know how subtle that shift can feel. If that sounds familiar, stay with me, because this part doesn't announce itself. The conversation moved easily. Same rhythm, same way of picking up threads and following them without forcing direction. At one point, she said, "I was thinking about what you said this morning." "Which part?" "About comparing everything." I nodded. "That made sense," she said. "It does now." She held that for a second, then said, "I think I did the opposite." I looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I didn't compare anything to this," she said. "I just kept it separate." That landed differently. Not better, just clearer. We sat with that for a moment. Then I said why. She thought about it. Not long. Just enough. "Because this didn't need anything from me," she said. That made sense. No expectation. No pressure. No version of the relationship that required effort to maintain. It just existed. And everything else did, she added. I nodded. That's accurate. The food came. We ate. Normal pace. No attempt to fill every second with conversation. That part didn't change. At one point, she looked at me and said, "We're not going to rush this." "No." "And we're not going to turn it into something complicated." "No." She nodded. Good. That was the closest thing to a boundary either of us said. And it didn't feel like one. Just alignment. We didn't talk about what this would look like long term. Didn't define anything beyond what was already clear. Because neither of us needed that yet. After we left, we walked for a bit. Same streets we had walked before. Nothing new. Just the same path. At one point, she said, "It's strange that nothing feels different." I looked at her. It does, I said. Just not in a way you can point to. She nodded. That's exactly it. There was no moment where we crossed into something else. No clear line. No shift you could identify from the outside. Just continuity, with awareness. The next few weeks stayed like that. No sudden changes. No dramatic adjustments. We didn't start seeing each other more. Didn't create new routines. We just stayed where we were, but with a different understanding of what it was. There were small things, subtle. The way she looked at me when I said something without thinking. The way I noticed when she was about to say something before she did. The way silence between us felt fuller, not empty. At one point, we were sitting in her apartment, around 9:10, nothing on, just quiet. She said, "Do you realize we've already seen each other at our worst?" I nodded. Yes. That makes this easier. It does. Because there was nothing to prove, nothing to hide, no version of ourselves that needed to be presented. That was the difference. Everything else I had experienced before required some level of adjustment. With her, there was none. Time moved, not quickly, just steadily, and without noticing exactly when it happened. We stopped referring to it as something we were trying. It just became what it was. There was no conversation where we defined it fully. No moment where we said, "This is now this." Because it didn't need one. It had already been built, long before we recognized it. And somewhere in that process, I realized something clearly. This wasn't something new. It was something that had been there the entire time, just waiting for us to stop treating it like it wasn't. At some point, we stopped noticing the transition. Not because it wasn't significant, because it didn't feel like one. There was no moment where everything changed. No clear before and after. Just continuity. The same conversations. The same places. The same way of understanding each other without needing to explain things fully. But now, there was awareness behind it. And that changed how it felt. I remember one morning around 7:20, sitting across from her in a small place we had been going to for years. Same table. Same order. Nothing new. She was halfway through a sentence when she stopped. Looked at me. Then said, "It's strange how this doesn't feel new." "It isn't," I said. She nodded. "That's what I mean. If you've ever stepped into something that feels familiar from the first moment, you know how different that is from starting something from the beginning. If that feels familiar, stay with me. Because this part doesn't build from nothing. It builds from what was already there. We didn't have to learn each other. That was the difference. No early stage where everything is being interpreted. No guessing what the other person means. No hesitation around saying the wrong thing. All of that had already happened. Years ago, at one point, she said, "We skipped the part where people try to be better versions of themselves." I nodded. "We don't have those versions." She smiled slightly. No, because she had seen me when things weren't working. When I didn't have answers. When I wasn't certain of anything. And I had seen the same from her. There was nothing left to reveal. That changed everything. Not in a dramatic way. In a practical one. We didn't have expectations that needed to be met. We already knew what was there. And that made everything simpler. There were still adjustments. Small ones. The way time was shared. The way plans were made. The way we showed up for each other. But none of it felt like work. Because it wasn't new behavior. It was just existing behavior placed in a different context. I remember one evening around 8:50, sitting in her apartment while she was explaining something that had gone wrong during her day. Halfway through it, she stopped, looked at me, then said, "You already know what I'm going to say next." "I do." "What is it?" "You're not wrong. You're just early." She laughed. "That's exactly it." Then shook her head slightly. "That's still one of the best things anyone's said to me." I nodded. "You said to me first." I know. That moment stayed. Not because it was important on its own, because it showed something clearly. We weren't building something new. We were continuing something that had already proven itself. Time moved the same way it always had. Weeks. Months. No milestones. No moments that needed to be marked. Just consistency. At one point, someone asked me, "How long have you two been together?" I paused. Not because I didn't know. Because the answer wasn't simple. "Depends what you mean," I said. They laughed. No, seriously. I thought about it. Then said, a few months or 10 years. They looked at me for a second. Then said, that's not a real answer. It is, I said, and I left it there, because there wasn't a cleaner way to explain it. We never tried to define why it worked. Didn't break it down. Didn't analyze it, because the more we tried to explain it, the less accurate the explanation felt. It wasn't about timing. It wasn't about chance. It wasn't about finally finding the right person. She had been there the entire time, and that's what made it clear. The only thing that had changed was that we stopped looking past it. One evening, we were walking back from dinner, same streets we had walked for years. She said, do you ever think about why it took so long? I looked ahead, then said no. Why not? Because it didn't take long. She looked at me, didn't say anything, because she understood exactly what I meant. It wasn't delayed. It wasn't missed. It happened when we were ready to see it, and not before. We didn't need to explain it after that. Didn't revisit the question. Didn't try to define it better, because we didn't need to. It worked. That was enough. And everything after that was just continuing something that had already proven it could last. 5 years later, it still doesn't feel like something we started. That's the first thing people don't understand when they ask about it. Our mornings are quiet, not silent, just settled. I'm usually up first. 6:30, kitchen, coffee. Same routine I had long before any of this changed. I stand at the counter while it brews. Same light coming through the window. Same reflection on the surface. Nothing about that part of my life needed to adjust. She comes in a few minutes later, not fully awake yet. Stops halfway through the doorway, sometimes like she's still deciding if she's ready to be part of the morning. Coffee? I ask. She nods, sits down, wraps her hands around the cup without drinking it right away. We don't talk at first. We don't need to. That part never changed. The difference is now it belongs to both of us. If you've ever built something with someone who already knows your worst days, you know how different that feels. There's no version of you that needs to be introduced. Nothing to manage. Nothing to protect. If that feels familiar, you already understand why this works. People still ask the same question. How did it start? Like there was a moment, a clear beginning, something they can point to. I usually pause for a second, then say, it didn't start. It changed. They look at me like that's not a real answer. But it is. It's just not the kind people expect. Because what we have now is built on everything that came before it. Not just the good parts. The difficult ones, too. The nights where things didn't make sense. The days where nothing held. The conversations that didn't lead anywhere. We were there for all of it, before any of this had a name. I remember one afternoon, maybe a year into this, we were sitting in that same cafe near the window. Same table we had used for years. Someone at the next table asked her, how long have you two been together? She looked at me, didn't answer immediately, then said, depends where you start counting. They laughed, like it was a joke, but she didn't adjust it, because it wasn't. That's the part that's hard to explain. There's no clean line, no version of this that begins at a specific point. It's just something that became visible. There's still normal days. That hasn't changed. Busy mornings. Work that stretches longer than expected. Small disagreements about things that don't matter as much as they feel like they do in the moment. But none of it threatens anything. Because nothing here is fragile. It was built long before it had pressure on it. One evening, around 9:40, she was sitting across from me, going through something from her day. Halfway through explaining it, she stopped, looked at me. You already know what I'm going to say, she said. I do. What is it? You're not wrong. You're just early. She smiled, then shook her head slightly. That's still one of the best things anyone said to me. I nodded. You said it to me first. I know. That stayed. Not because it was new, because it was still true. We still walked the same streets, same routes after dinner, same pace. At one point, a few months ago, she said, do you ever think about how easily we could have missed this? I looked ahead, then said, we didn't miss it. She glanced at me. Then what was it? I thought about that for a second, then said, we just didn't look at it. She nodded slowly. That feels right. That's the difference. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't delayed. It was there. The entire time. We don't try to explain it anymore. We tried in the beginning. To define it. To make it sound like something structured. It never came out right. Too simple. Or too complicated. Neither one fit. So we stopped trying. I remember one night, around 11:10, sitting outside after a long day. No real conversation. Just quiet. She said, if we had tried this earlier, do you think it would have worked? I thought about it. Not long. Just enough. No. She looked at me. Why not? Because we wouldn't have understood it yet. She leaned back slightly. Yeah, she said. That makes sense. That's the part people miss. It wasn't timing. It wasn't luck. It wasn't finally finding the right person. She had been there the entire time. The only thing that changed was that we stopped looking past it. If there's one thing I understand now, it's this. Sometimes the best thing in your life isn't something you find. It's something you finally recognize. If that feels familiar to you, you already know what that means. If there's someone in your life who has always been there, in a way that doesn't require effort, in a way that just holds, pay attention to that, because it might not be undefined. It might just be unrecognized. If this kind of story speaks to you, subscribe. There are more like this. And tell me this. Have you ever realized, not too late, not too early, just at the exact moment it mattered, that the person you were looking for was already there? Because sometimes the only thing that changes everything is finally seeing it.